I didn't just buy the land. I fought for it. After years of dealing with HOA nonsense, constant letters about grass length, fines for leaving a trash can out too long, neighbors peeking over fences to judge, I was done. I wanted peace. Real peace. When I found this property, I knew it was the one. 10 acres of open land, lined with oak trees, quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. No HOA. No rules. Just mine. I remember the day I closed on it. I stood at the edge of the property, hands on my hips, breathing in the crisp morning air. My dog, Max, ran circles around my feet, kicking up dirt and barking happily. I smiled. This is it, Max, I said, scratching behind his ears. No more rules. No more ridiculous fines. Just us. For the first time in years, I felt free. I started making the place my own, a garden here, a workshop there. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over my field, thinking how lucky I was, and for a while it was perfect, until the day I saw the sign. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was just starting to rise, and Max was sitting at my feet, watching the squirrels in the trees. I stepped outside with my coffee and froze. There were cars on my property, a whole row of them, SUVs, sedans, even a golf cart, lined up across my front field like it was a parking lot. I frowned and walked toward them, Max trotting alongside me. That's when I saw it. A sign, a bright blue sign staked into the ground like it had always been there. HOA overflow parking. My jaw tightened. My heart started to pound. I ripped the sign out of the dirt and turned toward the nearest car. A woman was sitting inside, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a to-go coffee. She lowered her window, eyebrows raised. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, holding up the sign. "What's this?" She gave me a tight smile. "Overflow parking. For the clubhouse." I stared at her. "This is my land." She blinked behind her sunglasses. "Oh, no. This is HOA property." My mouth fell open. "No, it's not." "Well," she said, smiling like she was talking to a child, "we've been using this area for years. If you have a problem with it, you'll need to talk to the board." Then she rolled up her window. I stood there, the sign still in my hand, my face burning. Max barked, sensing my tension. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't about to let this slide. I needed to know how bad it was. So I started walking the property. Max followed close behind as I traced the edges of the land, trying to calm down. That's when I saw the dirt path, worn down by tire tracks and foot traffic, cutting right across my field. It hadn't been there when I bought the property. Joggers were running down it like it was a public trail. A couple was walking their dog. They smiled and waved at me like I was a park ranger. Max barked at them, and they just laughed. But the worst part? A family was having a picnic. They had unfolded chairs, a full picnic basket, even a cooler. A man wearing a polo with the HOA logo on it looked up from his sandwich and smiled. I marched over. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You realize you're trespassing, right?" The man looked at me, unfazed. "Oh," he said casually, "well, technically this is community land." I frowned. "Community land?" He smiled. "Yeah, it's an established common area. The HOA has been using it for years." My stomach tightened. "This isn't part of the HOA." He shrugged. "That's not how it's been explained to us." Max growled low at my side. I took a breath. "You should leave." The man sighed and stood up, brushing crumbs off his pants. "You might want to check with the board about that." The board? Right. This was bigger than I thought. I didn't bother with a phone call. I wanted to see the look on their faces. The next morning, I drove to the HOA clubhouse, a fancy, modern building with glass walls and a perfectly landscaped entrance. I walked through the front doors and straight to the back office. Karen was sitting behind a massive oak desk, dressed like she was heading to a country club. The walls behind her were covered with photos of herself at HOA events, ribbon cuttings, fundraisers, even a Community Leader of the Year award. She smiled when I walked in. "Ah," she said, I was wondering when you'd show up. I dropped the parking sign on her desk. Care to explain why this was on my property? Karen glanced at it, unfazed. Ah, yes. That's part of the overflow parking designation. I folded my arms. My property is not part of your HOA. Karen tilted her head. There's been a misunderstanding. Oak Ridge Estates has been using that land for years. The homeowners have always enjoyed access to it. Enjoyed. I repeated. Karen, they were having a picnic on my land. She gave me a condescending smile. Well, technically that's debatable. Debatable? Karen reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick binder, flipping to a color-coded section. Prescriptive easement, she said smoothly. Since the HOA has maintained and used that land for years, the board has the right to request an easement review. I leaned forward. Karen, a prescriptive easement requires a court ruling, uncontested use, and formal documentation. You have none of that. Her smile faltered for a moment. Well, she said, recovering quickly, perhaps we can work out a shared use agreement? I shook my head. Not happening. Her smile tightened. We'll see. 2 days later, I found a thick letter in my mailbox. It was stamped with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA legal department seal. I opened it and scanned the first page. $500 for restricting public access. $750 for non-compliance with HOA standards. $11,000 for interfering with community functionality. I laughed. Actually laughed. The next morning, I stepped outside to find 4 HOA board members standing at the edge of my driveway. A tall man in a golf visor cleared his throat. We're here to discuss your ongoing violations. I leaned against my truck. What violations? The woman next to him held up a clipboard. The HOA has a long-established right to this land. We're moving forward with an easement review. I smiled coldly. Good luck with that. If you refuse to cooperate, she said, we'll have no choice but to take legal action. Max growled at her feet. I stepped closer. If I see anyone you step foot on my land again, I'll press trespassing charges. No warnings. No second chances. The board members exchanged nervous glances. They thought they could scare me. They thought wrong. 2 days after the HOA board showed up at my driveway, I got another letter. It was thick, printed on fancy paper with a gold HOA seal at the top. The kind of letter that's designed to make you feel small before you even open it. I sat down at the kitchen table. Max curled up at my feet and slid my finger under the edge of the envelope. Max lifted his head, sensing my tension. I unfolded the letter and scanned the first line. Final notice. You are in violation of Oak Ridge Estates HOA community access policies. My stomach dropped. I kept reading. $500 for unauthorized restriction of public access. $750 for non-compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. $11,000 for interference with community functionality. $11,000. I set the letter down and rubbed my temples. My pulse hammered in my ears. $11,000 for what? Protecting my own property? I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. They can't be serious, I muttered. Max sat up, his ears perked. He could tell I was on edge. I picked up the letter again, flipping to the last page. It was signed by the HOA's legal department, though I highly doubted the HOA actually had a real legal team. It was a threat, a scare tactic. They were trying to intimidate me into backing down, but I wasn't going to back down. The next morning, I found out just how far they were willing to push. I woke up to the sound of voices outside. Low, hushed tones. I walked to the window and saw 2 men in khakis standing at the edge of my property, holding clipboards. They were pointing at different parts of the field, making notes. Max growled. I pulled on a jacket and walked outside. Morning, I called out. The taller man smiled. Good morning. We're just conducting a property assessment. For what? The shorter one stepped forward. Community access. The HOA is moving forward with an easement review. I clenched my jaw. An easement review for land that doesn't belong to you? The tall man's smile tightened. It's part of the HOA's claim. This land has been used by the community for years. And you think that gives you the right to take it? He smiled wider. That's not for you to decide. Max's growling deepened. I took a step closer. Get off my land. If you refuse to comply, the shorter one said, the HOA may have no choice but to take legal action. I smiled coldly. Go ahead. They hesitated, exchanging glances. Then they turned and walked away. They thought they could scare me. They were wrong. The next day, Karen showed up with reinforcements. I was out front, tossing a ball for Max, when I saw them walking toward the driveway. For people this time. Clipboard guy was back, along with a woman in a pantsuit and 2 other HOA board members. And there at the back of the group was Karen, arms crossed, wearing a smug smile. Max's tail stiffened. He stood between me and them, his body tense. I crossed my arms. What now? Clipboard guy cleared his throat. We're here on behalf of Oak Ridge Estates to discuss the ongoing violations regarding community accessibility. I raised an eyebrow. Ongoing violations? The woman in the pantsuit stepped forward. You've restricted access to land that has historically been available for community use. My land. I corrected her. She smiled politely, ignoring me. The HOA has a long-established claim to this space. Wrong. She opened a folder. Since you made it clear that you don't wish to cooperate, the board has voted unanimously to assess your property for shared community use. Assess my property? Clipboard guy nodded. Yes. If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to take further legal action. Max barked sharply. The woman flinched. I smiled. Legal action for property you don't own? Karen finally stepped forward. This doesn't have to be difficult. Oh, it's not difficult, I said. It's illegal. Her smile faded slightly. The woman in the pantsuit stepped forward. If you just agree to a shared use agreement. I held up a hand. Stop. Karen's eyes narrowed. If I see any of you step foot on my property again, I will press trespassing charges. No warnings. No second chances. They hesitated. Karen's smile faded completely. I hope we're clear, I said. We were. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with voicemail from a guy named Greg. Hi. Just following up on your interest in purchasing a premium lot in Oak Ridge Estates. Let me know if you'd like to schedule a tour. My forehead creased. I called back. Greg speaking. Yeah, Greg. You left me a message about a property. Oh, yes. He sounded enthusiastic. Are you interested in one of our new premium lots? I frowned. Greg, I already own land here. There was a pause. Oh, well, there's been some recent expansion in the community. We have several new lots available with exclusive homeowner amenities. I sat up straighter. Exclusive amenities? Yes, private trails, picnic areas, and green spaces. My heart pounded. Greg, where exactly are these new lots located? Let me check. There was some paper shuffling. Then Greg read the address. My address. My grip tightened on the phone. Greg, who told you that land was available? The HOA. Karen provided the details. I opened my laptop and started digging. I found the HOA's official website. And there it was, under a new section labeled Community Expansion. A map with my property highlighted in HOA colors. They weren't just trespassing anymore. They were selling my land. The next morning, I heard the sound of a motor outside. I stepped onto the porch and froze. Landscapers. A guy on a riding mower was cutting my grass. Another was hammering a wooden post into the ground. I stormed over. Hey! The guy on the mower shut off the engine. Morning. What are you doing? Setting up the new HOA trail. My stomach flipped. What new trail? He pointed to the signpost. It read, Welcome to Oak Ridge Private Trails. HOA members only. My jaw tightened. Get off my land. The guy hesitated. Karen said, I don't care what Karen said. That was it. I called a contractor and ordered industrial-grade fencing, reinforced steel posts, anti-climb panels. Motion-activated cameras. How secure do you want it? The contractor asked. Fort Knox. Over the next week, they installed the fence. Every single access point the HOA had been using, the dirt paths, the walking trails, the makeshift parking spots. I sealed them all. The day after the fence was finished, I stood on my porch with Max at my side. Karen showed up right on time. She stood on the other side of the fence, arms crossed. What is this? I sipped my coffee. This is my property. You can't do this. Oh, but I can. She glared at me. This isn't over. I smiled. Oh, it is. It didn't take long for Karen to make her next move. The morning after the fence went up, I heard loud voices outside. Max's ears perked up, and he jumped off the couch, barking toward the window. I sighed, set down my coffee, and stepped outside. Karen was standing at the edge of the new fence, flanked by 2 HOA board members. Her arms were crossed, and her face was flushed red with anger. The 2 men beside her were dressed like they were heading to a golf tournament. Khakis, polos, and that same smug expression that said they thought they were better than you. Max let out a low growl, standing at my side. I scratched behind his ears and walked toward them. Morning, I said calmly. Karen pointed at the fence. You need to take this down. I smiled. Good morning, Karen. Her eyes narrowed. Don't play games with me. You're interfering with community access. No, Karen. I said, resting my hand on the top of the fence. I'm protecting my property. Her jaw tightened. You can't just block off shared land. I tilted my head. Shared land? I laughed. This isn't shared land. This is my land. Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red. You're being unreasonable. I'm being reasonable. I said, my tone steady. Unreasonable is installing a parking lot on land you don't own. Unreasonable is selling access to someone else's property. Unreasonable is showing up here and demanding that I let it happen. Karen stepped closer to the fence. You have no right. I held up a hand. Actually, I do. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Karen's eyes narrowed as I handed it over the fence. She hesitated before snatching it from my hand. It's a cease and desist order, I said. File with the county. The HOA and all its members are now formally barred from setting foot on my property. Karen's mouth opened slightly. And if you or anyone else in the HOA trespasses again, I added, you'll be facing criminal charges. She clenched the envelope in her hand. You're making a mistake. I smiled. No, Karen. You did. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, her eyes burning into mine. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, the 2 board members hurrying after her. Max barked once, wagging his tail. Good boy, I said, scratching behind his ears. Later that afternoon, my lawyer Dan called. Well, Dan said, his voice amused, Karen's already reached out to her legal team. Of course she has. They're claiming loss of community access. Dan said, they want you to remove the fence and compensate the HOA for the inconvenience. I snorted. Compensate them? Yeah, for the land they don't own. Do they even have a case? Dan chuckled. Not a chance. You've got the deed. The property lines are crystal clear. And the cease and desist was filed correctly. They don't have a leg to stand on. Good, I said. What's next? We go on offense, Dan said. His tone sharpened. I'm filing a lawsuit for trespassing, fraud, and unauthorized commercial use of your property. We've got more than enough evidence. How much are we talking? Dan paused. Enough to make them sweat. I smiled. Do it. And one more thing, Dan added. The HOA has been charging homeowners increased dues for access to your land. I sat up straighter. They charge people for access to my property? Yep, and we'll be seeking full restitution. My smile widened. Perfect. A week later, Dan filed a lawsuit. It was official. Karen was forced to respond. I saw her one morning, standing at the edge of the fence, talking on the phone. Her back was to me, but I could tell from the way her shoulders were tense that it wasn't a pleasant conversation. She turned toward my property and saw me standing on the porch. I raised my coffee in a silent toast. Her face darkened. "Game on," I muttered. The court case moved faster than I expected. Dan compiled a mountain of evidence. Screenshots from the HOA website advertising my land as exclusive community space. Copies of the HOA's welcome packet, showing my property on the map. Photos of the landscapers working on my land. Copies of the fake violation notices and fines. Karen's lawyer tried to argue prescriptive easement, but Dan shut that down in about 30 seconds. Prescriptive easement requires uncontested public use for a minimum of 15 years. Dan explained to the judge, "My client has contested the use of this land from day one." Karen's lawyer stammered. Karen sat at the defense table, arms crossed tightly. "And furthermore," Dan continued, "the HOA collected dues from homeowners under the false pretense that they had access to this land. That constitutes fraud." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Do you have evidence of that?" Dan slid a thick folder across the table. "It's all in there, Your Honor." The judge flipped through the papers, his eyebrows raising higher with each page. Karen's lawyer shifted in his seat. Karen's face was pale. After a long pause, the judge set the folder down. "This is not good." Dan smiled. "No, Your Honor, it isn't." The ruling came down harder than I expected. Karen and the HOA were found guilty of fraud, trespassing, and unauthorized use of private land. The court ordered full restitution of all HOA fees collected under false pretenses, additional fines for illegal land use. Karen was held personally liable for facilitating the fraud, and it got worse for her. During the investigation, it came out that Karen had been embezzling HOA funds for years, padding her personal accounts under guise of community improvement projects. She used HOA money to fund her lifestyle, vacations, designer clothes, even landscaping for her own house. Karen didn't just lose the case. She lost everything. Her position on the HOA board? Gone. Her reputation? Destroyed. Her bank account? Frozen. And the cherry on top? Karen was charged with criminal fraud and embezzlement. The last time I saw her, 2 sheriff's deputies were leading her out of her house in handcuffs. She saw me watching from my porch. I smiled and waved. She didn't smile back. After Karen was gone, the HOA collapsed. Without Karen pulling the strings, the board fell apart. The homeowners, finally realizing they'd been lied to, called for a vote. 2 months later, Oak Ridge Estates voted to dissolve the HOA completely. No more rules about mailbox colors. No more fines for leaving trash cans out. No more Karen. The morning after the vote, I sat on my porch with Max at my side. The sun was rising over my newly fenced property, casting golden light across the fields. Max nudged my hand. I scratched behind his ears. "You know what, buddy?" I said, smiling. "I think we've earned this." Max barked and wagged his tail. I sipped my coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the breeze through the trees. No more HOA. No more threats. Just peace and quiet. Exactly how it was always meant to be.